Hey, this is Steve, host of the show. We're going to do things a little bit different today. I will be playing you an episode from another podcast called AOL Underground, which I also host. I think you'll really like it. Check it out.
Welcome to AOL. Welcome to AOL Underground.
Would you please state your name and the years you worked at AOL?
My name is Erci Stern, and I worked at AOL from October 16th, 1995 until October 16th of 2007. That is exactly 12 years.
That's great. When did you first use a computer?
I first used a computer in the 6th grade in the library of my elementary school. It was an Apple IIe.
That's great. I also started on the Apple. What were you doing on the computer at that time in 6th grade?
It was open for any student who wanted to use it. It really wasn't plugged into anything other than itself. There was no internet or Ethernet or anything like that around. So those of us who had the inkling were writing super simple basic scripts, draw a circle, draw a square, print a smiley face, that sort of stuff. There was nothing terribly complicated going on. Although for us, it was terribly complicated. It was high tech. And then middle school, we had what they called patch PET computers, which were computers that the programming was recorded on audio cassette. So think about like Maxell cassette tapes. All of the programming was actually recorded onto the audio cassette. So you would write your program to the audio cassette, load the cassette into the playback deck, and play it back into the computer to get, your rocket to take off or a mathematical program to run an equation. This was in math class. We had the PET computers. And then I didn't actually have any computers in senior high. They didn't have any in the upper high school.
Interesting.
So then I didn't get back to computers again until college.
So then once you got to college, you revisited computers? Is yours your degree in computers or?
Yes, my degree is in computer science. I have a bachelor's of computer science. Actually went into computers because my mother was a biochemist and I thought biology was too easy. And she struggled with technology. And so I thought that if I got a degree in technology, I could help her. And if I ever needed anything, biochemical, she could help me. No, I just because I'd always grown up with her and her studying things biological and biochemical, it kind of felt easy to me because I kind of learned it with her. She was in college when I was in high school, and then she was in graduate school when I was in basic college, and so we kind of went to school together throughout our lives, and so I kind of knew everything she was studying. So it seemed more challenging to me. And my uncle was a physicist. He was an honest to God rocket scientist at Lawrence Livermore, and so I was fascinated by the work he did, and computer science seemed like the way to go as a different angle to get into physics and to get into rocket science.
So you wanted to eventually go into physics and rocket science?
I wanted to be an astronaut. I wanted to go to Mars. That was honestly, if you asked me what I wanted to be when I was 18, I wanted to be the first woman on Mars.
And so then you got your degree in computer science. And what was the atmosphere like then? Like, were there a lot of women in computer science or not?
No, there were 2 women, myself and one other lady, in my graduating class in 1990. It was definitely a male-dominated career field. And unlike the career field of today, it was a very singular career field. You got a degree in computer science. You didn't get a degree in programming. You didn't get a degree in networking. You didn't get a degree in architecture. You got a double E engineering degree, or you got a computer science CS degree. Those are kind of your choices. And so it was, in some ways, I feel it was a little more well-rounded education because you had to do a little bit of everything. We had to learn programming, we had to learn architecture, we had to learn networking, we had to learn all of those things to get our degree. It was less specialized, but at the same time, the people who are coming out now get a very specialized degree and they can walk in and do a very skilled job at a very specific thing. So it really depends on whether you want to be a specialist or generalist, as one of my coworkers would describe it. And I feel very comfortable being a generalist, being the kind of person who can walk in and say, "Oh, you need something, re-networked? Sure, I can do that. Oh, you need something programmed? Sure, I can do that. Oh, you need something, um, you need an operating system installed? Sure, I can do that. Just whatever it is that you need, I can do it, or I can read about it and I can fix it." But I think a lot of the people graduating in the last decade, and especially now, if they don't have a focus in that, they really don't have the background to be able to just pick it up and run with it.
Right. So are you saying that they taught you like subnetting and about networks and like TCP/IP and things like that with your degree?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. I had networking, I had kernel level programming, I had circuit level design, I had pretty much everything. I mean, everything down to from circuit boards all the way up to, what then was the highest level programming language that was being used, which was Pascal, which, these days would be, C or Java or something like that. But that was what was being taught in the curriculum. You went from, programming in binary all the way to, you know, developing web interface programs and things like that. It just really depended on where you wanted to take your career ultimately. If you wanted, you could take more programming courses or you could take more engineering courses, but you had to take some of everything to get the degree.
Got it. So how did you end up working at AOL?
Like I said, I got the job in 95. Depending on how much history you know, 95 was in the middle of the Gulf War. I was working right out of college for the government, for the Defense Department, and I was working on programs supporting the Gulf War. And I found myself frustrated and a little bothered by what was going on over there, the killing, and I didn't feel comfortable supporting it. And I wanted to look around, but working in a classified government facility, I had no access to be able to print resumes. And at home, we only had a dot matrix printer. And my husband was at AOL, and he said, let's print your resume up here. And so we did, but he forgot it, left it on the printer. And one of the managers at AOL wandered by the printer to get his own print job, picked it up, saw the last name, went over to my husband and said, "Is this guy your brother?" The reason they said that is my name is spelled Erci, and a lot of people think that it's a typo for Eric. And he looked at George and said, "Well, no, this would be Erci, my wife." And so George said, "Well, is she looking for a job?" And he was like, "Well, yeah, it's a resume." So I got a call. And both him and Brian, who you spoke to before, they both interviewed me and they both competed for me. And I ended up working for George. But that's how I got there, was because my husband forgot my resume on the printer.
Got it. And so what was it like when you first started working at AOL? Like if you compare that to with the government and the Gulf War and stuff like that?
Oh my goodness. It's a culture shock because it feels like a family and a party atmosphere and a free for all. It feels like it's moving 10 times as fast as the government. In reality, it's not 10 times as fast, but it feels like it. Government procurement, government delivery of hardware, of software, of all of that moves at a very slow, very deliberate pace. At AOL, you could call Hewlett Packard on a Friday, and on a Monday, you'd have a pallet of hardware. And you'd have to put it someplace and get it plugged in and get it installed and get the operating system installed and all of that, usually by the following Friday. And you'd never have that kind of turnaround with the government. So I had walked into a shop where my previous job, I had been in a lot of hurry up and wait situations, which were real hurry up and wait. We have to get this done. Oh, but you're not the right person, so you can't do it, even though I would ask to do it. And then I ended up in places where at AOL where they're like, "Okay, we have all of that over there. You see that stack of boxes that's taller than you are? Put those in the rack over there on the right." tomorrow or between now and tomorrow, and get help if you need it, but that's what has to be done. And so you just worked until the job got done. That was expected of everybody. It worked like a startup. It really did, even though it was growing constantly. It was in growth period between 95 and 2000, 2002, serious growth period. But it had an internal feel of a startup, especially in the operations side of the house. It really felt like a startup. It was growing. It was evolving in its evolution because of the way it was growing. You'd be an operations team 1 month, and then you would be the operations mail team for 6 months, and then you'd be the operations inbound mail team, and then you'd be the operations spam team, and then you'd continue to morph and get a little tighter, and your focus would get a little tighter with each modification. You were still kind of under the same umbrella, so you were still that same family, but your focus would shift a little bit. And so you could see the growth of the company, but still that overall feel was always fun. I mean, a coworker and I would do an Easter egg hunt every year inside the building. We would get, the plastic eggs and put chocolates or raffle tickets, because they always had raffles at the company for different things, movie tickets, things like that. And we would just scatter them around the building. We'd put them in the data centers, they're plural. We'd just do that. And then, people would, throughout, whatever day was closest to Easter, would just go finding Easter eggs. We would have Mardi Gras parties. We would have, Halloween parties. Pick your holiday, pick your reason. We'd have Diwali for the folks from India. We would have Jewish holidays. We'd have, like I said, pick your nationality or whatever. We were extremely inclusive, and give us a reason to eat, to party, to get together, because tomorrow you might be working 12 hours. So, if you can have some downtime on one day when you're going to work really hard the next day, it makes it fun. And that's what the government never was, and since has never been. I've never been at a government facility since that has been fun. So
yeah, that definitely makes sense. You were talking about racking servers. So would you rack them and set them up?
Yeah. If you were the first team I worked with was the web department. We were standing up the web servers. They were SGI. I can't remember the brand name specifically. They were, I think, 2U, 3U servers. And we were standing these up, a rack at a time, basically. And there were 6 of us on the team, and any given moment, 2 or 4 of us would be in there, racking them, and then another person would be back at their desk doing pixie boots, pushing out the operating system. We had a pre-configured operating system, and we just pushed the same operating system out to every one of the servers. And then after that, we'd make whatever specific modifications, change the HTTP site to the specific customer's information, update the IP addresses, update any specific details necessary for the customer, and then push the private site pages onto it. But our initial configs were pre-made and held on back then it was SVN subversion server. But yeah, we kept everything there and used that to push stuff out.
So did you have were there multiple customers per host, or was it one customer per host, or how'd that work?
It was one customer per host. This was in the early days. We didn't start multi-homing web servers until probably the second or third year, because mostly, the clients were paying for a private server for the most part. We did a lot of multi-homing of internal stuff.
Were you assigning external IPs to each of the hosts, or?
We had, we had DMZs and stuff like that. So, AOL was behind a DMZ, and the term is escaping me now.
So it was NATed or something?
Round robin. If you went to 1234, 1234 would hit the DNS round robin, and it would determine which of the 25 web servers had the lightest load and would just go to that one. And then on the back end, we would keep those servers parallel. So that's how it would load balance early on. And then, of course, load balancing technology improved. And so we just keep improving the infrastructure behind the DMZ. So, but a lot of the smaller website companies didn't pay for multiple web servers, so they just got one.
Okay, that makes sense. So then,
Mm-hmm.
what was the web server that was used back then? Was it Apache or?
Well, we were using Apache, and then when we purchased Netscape, we were using them.
Oh, I didn't know Netscape had a server. That's interesting.
It had some modified Apache version. It had a name, and I can't remember what it is now. But it was Netscape. There was a Netscape front end for the browser, because then we went and modified the name and called it AOL something. We called it AOL Server on the back end.
Oh.
So then we were replacing everything that was Apache with AOL Server.
And the AOL server was the renamed Netscape.
Was the modified Netscape a server? Yeah.
Wow, that's really cool. I was wondering how AOL server came about. And what did you think about AOL server compared to Apache?
I like Apache. I mean, I could still do Apache in my sleep. So, and I've always wanted to learn Nginx, but I've never had a reason to. I've never had a customer who's ever wanted it because, I think everybody knows Apache and everybody's comfortable with Apache. So,
yeah, definitely. I think I made a switch from Apache to Nginx, I don't know, like 6 or 7 years ago. They're both pretty similar. I mean, the end of the day.
Yeah, I suspect that. I've just, like I said, I've never had a personal reason to. I don't run a website of my own anymore. So,
I think you're talking before about was the Food Network, or you said there were some customers that had FTP servers, right? And I don't know, can you tell me some of the challenges, I guess?
Yes, several of the discovery services, so Food TV, HGTV, those two I remember specifically. They had web servers, and they were the beginning and the bane of my security existence at the beginning of that evolution, because they demanded open anonymous FTP to the internet. We tried a lot, repeatedly, to dissuade them from using the open anonymous FTP.
This is read and write, right?
Both read and write. We said, please ask your customers to at least log in. You can have them log in. You give them free. They don't have to sign up for AOL. They need them log in so that there's some accountability with what gets posted, and they wouldn't buy it. They wouldn't accept it. So we spent a lot of time chasing Warez, or Warez, however you want to pronounce it, software. The Food TV in particular was taken over multiple times by anytime a new Microsoft product came out, anytime a new Lotus Notes came out, anytime a new game came out. Everybody and their brother was posting their ripped version to the anonymous FTP, and then we're going into the chat rooms and saying, hey, go get it here. And so we would just get swamped. And I was using one of the early generation security tools called Swatch, which was a file system file watching tool. And it would tell me anytime files with certain attributes or names would show up in a file system. So if I had my FTP partition and I said, tell me anytime Microsoft shows up here, I'd get a page. The big night that Microsoft launched a whole new version of its Office suite, I received over 10,000 pages and was called numerous times by our network operating center because I crashed the pager system. Literally took it offline.
Because there was 10,000 files written?
Well, the software was repetitive. I mean, this was first generation alerting software. This wasn't the best. But it kept repeating. It kept alerting me.
Oh.
And I didn't get to it fast enough to cut it off, to stop the alerts in time. So it had sent out 10,000 messages, and it had gone 10,000 messages to the paging system, and the paging system had sent 10,000 messages to AT&T. And somewhere in the telephone Ethernet were 10,000 messages waiting to get to my pager. So it was a very long night waiting for all of those pages to get through. But it was also a long night cleaning up those files and continuing to clean those files and trying to contact the customer to explain to them what was going on and why this was a bad idea. And, they didn't want to be contacted in the middle of the night any more than we wanted to contact them in the middle of the night. And so it really became a game of whack-a-mole to constantly, the moment you saw something, just delete it. Just don't alert on it, just delete it. We may or may not have deleted customer files accidentally, but we had to basically write a policy for the customer that said we can't be held responsible for files that may have a name or a profile that fits that which parallels illegal software. We have to protect ourselves, and in so doing protect you. And I think that may have begun part of the relationship killer that we had with Discovery, because not too long later, Discovery went and started its own online service.
Oh, interesting. So
Yeah.
you configured Swatch with specific like regular expressions or strings that if it saw that file, it would delete it. And then did you have like eventually specific file types or something you would allow, or you would like decompress stuff, or what?
Mostly, if it was mostly just file names. This was not terribly sophisticated to begin with. So if it said Microsoft Office, if it said Word, Microsoft Word. The hard part with looking for file types is, people were putting up recipes, so they're putting up Word files, they're putting up Excel documents, they're putting up things like that. So file types would be even more dangerous. If you just went and deleted every Word document, you'd end up, killing 2/3 of the customer content. So it was a lot of looking for, zipped files, or looking for RAR files, or looking for things like that. Those were a lot more suspect than, somebody's .txt or .wrd or whatever the extension is, or doc, or whatever the extension of the day was. So that would be, it was very selective. And then we got some hardcore coders in the group, and they started writing tools that were much more sophisticated than Swatch. Swatch's real intent was just as a log tracking tool. I was stretching it beyond its normal functionality. So.
Got it. So the folks uploading the Warez, did they start to notice this and start to name the files differently or anything, or?
I don't think so. Partially because there were just enough different open and anonymous FTPs that they could just, populate their software 5 or 6 different places, and it didn't matter. And, we didn't have a whole lot of control over our customers. We didn't have much ability to say, thou shalt not have an open and anonymous FTP, because that was the contract they signed with AOL. So, we were on the bottom of the totem pole when it came to this. It was like, you shall build a web server with an open and anonymous FTP because we signed this with Discovery and this is what they want. And we're like, oh, glad you asked.
Interesting. So you had to work within those parameters.
Yes.
Did you have any issues with malware on those, or?
Oh yeah. Not the malware that was, come get this malware. It wasn't deployed into the servers.
Oh, so but wasn't like, I don't know, muffins doc.
It wasn't like people injecting worms. It wasn't like people injecting worms and stuff. No, that was all coming in people's emails, and that was infecting everybody's workstations. That was a totally different problem.
Got it. Okay.
But mostly there, we were all using Unix or Macintosh-based workstations at our desks. So we didn't have a whole lot of problem at our desks. People who were having problems at their desks were the people in the more office positions, the people at the more executive level, the people more at the corporate level. They were the ones using the PCs and the Macs day to day. So down in operations and engineering, where we were, we didn't see a whole lot of that, again, because we were spending our time on pretty much 100% in Unix.
Right. What kind of problems did they have?
Oh, they got all the malware and the viruses and They got the worms and they got the Trojans and they got all that fun stuff. But it was the office support team that dealt with them for the most part. We didn't really have to.
Got it. So you were helping to keep up the production websites, and
Yes, I was in production. Yes.
and then became the mail servers. Was that later or?
Yeah, my team started in web, and then web and mail got merged together because they were both internet services. And then they got separated apart again, and then I siphoned through mail to security. And then from security became part of the test organization, and within test was part of the test and security team, doing information security while people were putting their code or their portion of the service through test. So I think I had mentioned that we have this the service in production is broken down into things called pods. So the front end of the service, so where the customers connect and where all of that customer facing infrastructure, so all of the chat room infrastructure, all of the game infrastructure, all of the web interface infrastructure, all of that sits in a pod, and we would have many pods, 20, 30, 40, depending on where in the country you were or where around the globe you were, pods in a data center. And each pod is that entire infrastructure. And so that might consist of 25 systems, 25 computers. That makes a pod. So the test P, which is what we had as a test environment, was the scaled down version of that. So the test P was 10 systems, 10 computers, smaller in scale, but still the same hardware. So if you had an HP doing a certain service, we still had an HP. It was just a little less RAM, a little less hard, a little less disk, a little less CPU, because we're just doing a test. We're not putting 10,000 members on it. We're going to put 100. We're that sort of thing. So we just had a scaled down environment. So we called it the test P because it was a P pub. That was the internal joke. So in the test P, one of the checkoffs that you had to pass was you had to pass a certain number of security checks. And they involved things like all of the typical syntax input checks. If you're expecting an email address, if I put something in there that doesn't have an @ sign, or I put something in there that doesn't have a period, does it pass the syntax? If I just put a screen name and no at some, AOL.com, does it pass? If I put Erci at yahoo.com, does it let me log in or does it not? What is it expecting? Making sure that you have all of those integrity checks throughout the whole series of pieces of the service. So if you've got an input, does it pass the input? Does it, we're starting to get to this point where we're starting to work with things like SQL injection. We're starting to work with input, injections into the URL. We're starting to work with injections and buffer overflows and stuff like that. So this is what we did a lot of in the test P with our information security testing in the test P. We had a suite of tests that we ran. They were all internally homegrown. This was prior to getting a hold of any compiled tests. This was before really Red Hat even had become popular. And so, like Red Hat has its own test suites that it's built in from the government security auditing processes that kind of people run now kind of across the board. But it was prior to all of that. So everything we were doing was pretty much homegrown. And so there were a couple of people in the company that we would kind of get together periodically, kind of off to the side away from the test P, and just sit there and say, okay, we're doing this, we're checking passwords, we're doing this, we're checking all the inputs in this, we're doing this, we're checking for what's going on with these fields, but we don't have any way to check backend data to see if the backend data is corrupted. So how do we check? And so we start drilling into that. And a lot of my focus at that point was just making sure that all those checks were being taken care of. I was moving a little bit away from the information security technologically and moving more into the information security management aspect. So when I was starting to bend a little bit toward the management side of the house at this point. So I was working on making sure that the checks were being done, making sure the results were being recorded, anything that failed, making sure it was being recorded, why it failed, and how it was being resolved. And so that was where I was starting to bend at that point. So,
You're talking about the integrity of the data once it arrived?
yeah, the integrity of the data once it arrived into the system.
I'm thinking in terms of like the input checks. So you were saying like an email address that was lacking an @ symbol. Was that like a client side check, or was it also a server side check as well?
Both. It could be both. If the client typed in, did the server send it correctly? Did the developer develop their code properly? If the code was supposed to strip it out, did it get stripped out properly? You really needed to check from A through Z in a process, because if you sent it in one form, but the end result, it needed to be in a different form. Was it converted properly? If it came in all caps from a PC, but Linux or Unix is case sensitive, and in the Unix database it's all in lowercase, it's not going to match. So at some point it needs to be lowercase. So what do you do? When does that happen? How soon does that happen, and at what point is it a must happen, or else you don't have a match? That sort of thing. So we spent, especially in the test P group, we got to know a whole bunch of the different components of the company and a whole bunch of the different development teams, because you would find really weird little problems, things that, especially stuff that developers like, but I never wrote that code. That code's been there for 5 years. I'm like, oh, it's wrong now. So they'd have to go find somebody to fix it, because it had never failed until they wrote this new module, and suddenly it was failing. And it's like, you have to deal with the cascade of change. And so there's a lot of that would happen.
Yeah, right. I mean, there's technical debt because turnover and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I was wondering, did you ever have like security incidents that then caused you to update your test plan? Like basically, you remediate it, let's say it's like a SQL injection or whatever, buffer overflow, and then you're like, okay, well now we need to update and test for this at every release because this happened or that happened.
Thankfully, the majority of the security incidents that I've been involved with have been post AOL. So that, and the reason I say thankfully is I think that the security incident model has matured significantly since leaving AOL. I think that had things like Heartbleed or the Log4j issues, I think if those things had been happening in the early 2000s, we'd still be scrambling. We'd still really not know what's going on, because the depth of information that's had to be recorded and tracked down and just repeatedly gone back and gone back and gone back. Especially like in my current job with Log4j, I've got customers who are like, they're not looking. I can reload that Docker that had that Log4j in it. And the next day it's like, nope, you got it there. You got to delete it again. It's like constantly having to do that. And if you're not on the ball and on top of these things, these problems can just pop back up. And in a service where we had, 5, 10, 25, 30 million customers, and there are people who can find a way to manipulate the system or manipulate another user's PC, which is really more of the threat, I think, than necessarily manipulating the AOL service itself, but manipulate another user's PC to do something that then compromises their computer and compromises their stuff, and then their recourse is to say it's AOL's fault. Then we have to justify how it's not, and it's more, in that case, it becomes more of a time-consuming, how do we help the customer get out of the situation they're in, because we're good citizens and we're going to help them, even if it's not our data specifically, because it's our data collaterally. And so that would at this point, that I think, like I said, I don't think we'd survived some of these things. I mean, we did have some of the early worms and stuff like that did hit, but it wasn't, thankfully it didn't hit the internal architecture.
So customers would blame AOL if they got a virus or something?
There are a lot of people out there who don't understand, especially back then, didn't understand computers. The running joke is, I don't know what's going on. My cup holder is broken. Um, that was serious. People were calling because they didn't understand what their CD tray was for. They did not know really what they had. They had computers and they weren't using them properly. To this day, my ex mother-in-law will routinely call, or my aunt will routinely call and say, my computer's running slow. What kills me is my aunt's on a Mac, so I don't know how she manages to do this. But she'll call, and it's like, okay, how did this get so difficult? I mean, you've been using a computer now for over 20 years. How is it you still don't understand? But it's a generational thing. I mean, the baby boomers are growing up and growing old, so they're kind of passing away. But still, there's a generation that's having trouble really connecting to the technology, and we hit the early edge of that generation as the older edge of our customers, and have ridden that wave the entire time. And so they've always been, the parents or the grandparents of all of our customers. And I have a funny story from when I was working in games. I was working on a game called Slingo, which was a combination of slots and bingo. Very addictive game, actually. Very simple, very easy, but very addictive. Kind of like a lot of the simple puzzle games that are out now. But at first, you would just play with random people, but then they made a modification to the game, and you could set up a room and you could play with selective people, and you could select the people that you played with. And so all of a sudden, it was, grandma and granddaughter, or aunt and nephew, or, mother and son. And these people would be playing. And then if the game went down, literally all hell would break loose. And my customer would get bombarded with nasty messages, and messages with curse words that you don't expect to hear from a grandma, about how you've just ruined their day because you've broken their communication with their granddaughter, or cut them off in the middle of a chat with their nephew while they were playing this game, and how dare you take their effing time away. And it was just, honestly, I didn't believe them until one day I actually had to ticket in with my network operations team to take out the old server. I'd migrated them over to a new server, more high power, more disk space. Everything was great. That server was on the upper half of a rack. Their old server was in the lower half of the rack. And I'd put a ticket in to have the server in the lower half of the rack decommissioned, taken out of the rack and taken to the back so that HP could decommission it. About 2:00 in the afternoon, my phone starts ringing. Pick it up. It's the customer. They're like, what's the matter? I'm like, what do you mean, what's the matter? And something's happened to the system. I am getting bombarded by customers. The system's down. So the first thing I do is I try to ping the computer and it's not responding. And I said, I will get right back to you. So I hung up on him. I tried to ping it one more time, and I ran downstairs. Luckily, at that time, both the computer and the network operations center were downstairs in my building. I ran downstairs. I went to the desk that supported me, and I said, we need to find this computer. It's offline. And so we went out to the floor tile that it was supposed to be sitting on. It was empty. So then we went back and tried to find out what happened. Found that the hardware support staff had misread the ticket, and instead of just removing the server, they removed the rack. They unplugged the whole thing and wheeled it out into the hallway. So we pulled it back into the room, plugged it back in, and thankfully it came back online. Did a whole lot of checking and whatever, managed to get it back online, managed to get the game started again, contacted the customer, explained, mea culpa, apologized for, me and everybody that it had happened. And I said, but I still can't believe that, you were sweared at by, grannies. So he sent me a couple examples. He took the screen names off, but he sent me the text of these messages. These little old ladies were F-bombing this guy right, left, and sideways. I mean,
Wow.
the emotions that, they were putting into this, and it was very much a generational thing. And I think, so obviously some people get it, but there were a whole lot that still didn't. And, it was just, that was, I think, one of the most stressful and most fun days, because I got to read customer mail that was shocking.
Was Slingo free?
Yes, Slingo was free.
And they were that mad about a free service?
Oh yeah. They were, anytime I had to schedule an outage, like if I had to do patching that required rebooting the box, I had to give them 2 weeks notice. I had to post a notice board on the game that like sat on the top line banner for a week with, it's going to be down from, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern, such and such a date. It's like we had to, it was courtesy for the customers, but there was no guarantee. There was nothing that said, this game's going to be up 24/7, 365. It was just, I was doing it because the customer was a cool guy and he was really nice about it. And, I was just being nice to him, but it was just so funny. It was so funny. And yeah, they were that hot about the game not being available.
Interesting. What other games did you support over at AOL?
Everything that was on the system that wasn't a MUD.
What's a MUD?
Multi-user dungeon. I don't think we really had a MUD, but we had a couple multi-user games. But we had, I can't really remember a lot of the names anymore.
Neverwinter Nights?
Oh yeah. Yeah, we had that one. We had one that was short-lived that was a lot of fun. It was a spaceship chase game. It wasn't like Galaga. It was like a more three-dimensional. My coworkers were constantly asking me to give them cheat codes. I was like, I don't have one for myself. How can I give you one? So
that's funny. The folks at the re-AOL project, they got Slingo working again.
Ah, they did? Oh, I'm gonna have to go find it. I love that game.
Yeah, I was playing it the other day. Yeah, it was good.
I love that game. Yeah, the guys, they actually, as a one day, so this is back when you could actually give gifts. They sent me one holiday season. They sent me this huge gift basket with like fruit and a t-shirt and a little battery operated Slingo, little handheld Slingo.
Oh wow, I didn't know they made those. That's cool.
I didn't either until I got it, and I kept it for years and years and years. It finally died, and it would no longer play.
Do you still have it, the broken one?
No. It's probably worth money, but no, I don't have it. It got lost somewhere in one of my moves. But yeah, no, I loved that game. God, it was so much fun.
That's really cool. So you had mentioned before on the other episode about some of the folks who were trying to hack AOL and then hiring them, like flipping them.
I wasn't directly involved with any of that, but most of the ones that I know just as acquaintances, they were brought in predominantly then as developers, because the ones that we did, and the one who was Jay Levitt was just brilliant. He came in as a kid. I mean, the kid like 17, 18. I mean, he was just brilliant. It's really hard to say anything about him other than, he just, you had a question about coding, you just went to Jay. I mean, he's just so smart. Now, the people that really hunted him down and then would go to flip them, Jan really was more involved in that, and Craig. But, and if you could ever get a hold of him, Jeff Bushy, who was my boss in the security days, he's a bit secretive these days. But no, I wish I had more for that. Sorry.
No worries. So you went from starting out doing web server administration and then evolved into the mail servers, and then it got more narrowed with the mail servers, right? Like incoming. And then you said you got kind of on the security testing side where you test the inputs, and then it moved to the kind of like project management side of it. Is that right?
Yeah, from security, there was a great need then for project management, and I was already going for my PMP in the security team, so I went ahead and finished. And then the company was basically snapping up every PMP that was being produced and spreading them around the company. So I went to the development side of the house with my PMP and took the information security knowledge that I had and used that to help influence the project development and to integrate more testing into project development. The one thing that I think that I like a lot about the career I've had is that because I started in operations and I went into information security and then I went into project management, focused on the dev side, and then I've kind of swung back into operations as I've kind of seen, and I've done some QA at other places. I've kind of seen the whole production cycle associated with, getting a piece of code from concept to deployment. So I kind of know the different points where you have to kind of stop and think and say, hey, does this still work? We've developed it, we need to test it. Okay, we've tested it, we need to send it to QA. Does QA still pass it? Nope, there's something wrong, so we have to send it back. Then we need to test it again, send it to QA. Does QA pass it? Yes. Okay, now we need to send it to a test deployment facility. Does it deploy in test? Yes. Okay, great. Now we can deploy to production. Does it deploy in test? No. Okay, what do we have to do to fix it? Take it all the way back to dev, or just take it back one step? It's like it's so helpful to know, because so many times you'll meet a project manager who's just gone through a project management career. They've never done anything operational. They've never done anything QA. They've never done really anything but like the development lifecycle. So all they know is that a developer is going to tell them, yeah, it's going to take me 4 weeks to develop that. The developer, unless they're really pushed to test, unless they're really pushed to QA their code, they're not going to add that extra time that's necessary. They're going to say, okay, I've written it, it's got out the door, I'm done, I'm going to move on to the next thing. They're not going to want to go back and revisit what they've done. So having the extra experience to know that, okay, if you're telling me 4 weeks, I'm going to pad at least 2 more weeks onto that, because I'm going to make you revisit this if for no other reason that I want to make sure it deploys. And I'm going to guarantee you a QA person's going to find at least one thing wrong. If you're that good a coder that there's nothing wrong with it, I'm still going to want it to be checked again because I don't believe it. It's like, I don't think anybody can write perfect code. So, it's the experience that I've gained and the knowledge that I have from how long it truly takes to get something from development into production is something that I think not everybody in my position has. And I think that's been biggest benefit I've gained from taking the career path that I did.
Yeah, definitely. It's always super helpful to have a technical project manager that actually knows what's going on and holds people accountable.
Yep.
So after you left AOL, I know later you got some certifications and stuff. Did you stick with security or more on the project management route?
I pretty quickly went right back into systems administration I've always kind of hung a security door knocker on my resume. Security, kind of like I was saying toward the beginning, now more of the jobs these days and more of the graduates these days are coming out with very focused careers. So if you're coming out with a security or an IT security degree. So a lot of the real quote security jobs are going to people with those degrees. So a lot of what I have for information security is homegrown knowledge, is knowledge from coalescing all of the information that I've learned over the years, and the couple of certifications that I do have, and the hope that somebody will give me enough time to actually finish a couple of certifications I've been trying to get for the past couple of years. So it's more that I have an extreme interest in security, and I always will, and I always have. And that anytime anybody gives me an opportunity at a job to do it, I will do it. But it's not an official part of my job title. I've wanted to become a security, I guess, security officer. I guess that's what they call a lot of the people these days. An information security officer. I've always wanted to be a red hat. I've always wanted to be the bad guy. But I've done a lot of the blue hat, a lot of the defending. So I've always wanted to become one of the offending people, just because it's a different side of the house. Starting pretty much as soon as I left AOL, I jumped back into the government. And the first thing you start dealing with as soon as you get into an IT job with the government is, you know, even at the lowest level, simple things like firewalls, simple things like how do you get information in and out of a system. You don't necessarily think of that as information security, but it is. It's low level. It's not, heavy duty security applications. But, when somebody says, well, I can't get data from my computer to the computer down the street, there's something blocking it. So you've got to deal with the security problems that are there. Or when you realize that you can get from your computer to the computer down the street and you shouldn't be able to, you've got to deal with that. So it's been an active part of my career ever since.
You had mentioned some security incidents after leaving AOL. Are you able to talk about any of those?
I can talk about them in generalities.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't need like specific company names or anything.
A lot of the incidents will get a notification either through official channels like the CERT board, or an email notification from a senior leader, a senior IT person, depending on if you're in a 24/7 shop, who's up first. If you're the responsible party, like in my current job, I'm the responsible party. So I keep an eye on like what Red Hat's producing as far as their messaging, and I keep an eye on what the agency security team sends out to read, to make sure that it applies or doesn't apply to our systems. And then you act upon what they say. So if it's a major incident like the Heartbleed or this current Java problem that's going on, you deal with the immediate issues of what systems are affected. So different vendors have different protocols for dealing with it. Different agencies have different protocols for dealing with it. There have been some incidents that have required just taking a service offline. There have been
SolarWinds.
Yes, exactly. Feel free to interject. There have been some that are, I wouldn't necessarily say optional, but they're the sort of thing where it's an informational problem. It's like, be aware that this has the potential of causing a opening to your system over this particular port or portal. Under this very specific, very well defined, but now publicly defined condition. So, and I think by publicly defining it, everything becomes much more vulnerable. So as soon as things like, DISA or CERT or those organizations start publishing the information, everything is a vulnerability at that point. I think even if they say it's not necessarily a truly system crashing vulnerability, it still becomes one.
Have you always been in a situation where you knew all the systems and what they were, like, and had a configuration like management database? Or is it sometimes you get asked a question and you're like, well, I have no idea because we actually don't have an inventory of our systems?
My current job, we are still processing through everything. For the federal government, they do this thing called an ATO, or an authorization to operate. And we're in the process of doing our ATOs for the next fiscal year. So we're doing it for November. And to do the ATO, you have to pass the STIG, or the security check checklists that DISA puts out. And we've got some systems we're passing just fine. We've got other systems I don't think we're even touching, because I walk past them in the data center and I don't see them in our inventory list. I keep checking and I keep asking, but I get no answer. So, and I don't have a login on them. So they're either not our systems, or they're not currently known, and that's worrisome to me. But I'll be honest, I'm leaving them for last, because we'll get the 80-20 rule, and we get the 80% done, and then I'll deal with the 20% that I can't address. Because once the 80%'s done, that 20 will be much easier to handle. But yeah, I don't think there's ever been a job where I've been 100% in the know. Even at AOL, there's always been a risk of being not 100% in the know, but at AOL, I think that was probably the most comprehensive, because there were people whose job it was to be responsible for the data centers. Their job was to walk up and down those floors, make sure computers were on, make sure they were labeled, make sure they were cabled, make sure everything had a rack and row and elevation and was charted in a tool. And they weren't great tools back then. They were probably just spreadsheets, but they were identified. And right now, that doesn't exist for me in my current position. We've got one team that has a great tool, makes these great graphical charts, but you can't print from it. And my team doesn't have edit rights, so we can't add any data to it. So I have to make a spreadsheet to go parallel with it that I can print. So I still have two tools that I'm using. So it's it's not as ideal as it could be.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's that. I think that's one other drawback, and I think some of that more between commercial versus government, not necessarily AOL versus government, is there's a stronger sense of fiefdom in the government. So the team that does manage the data centers, that's their world, that's their fief. You can't get in there other than to do your little part, which is to rack a computer and power it on. But they're going to be the ones that control the elevation chart. So you can rack it, you can power it on, and then you go back to your desk and you do whatever you need to do from your desk. Don't go mucking around with anything else. Don't touch anything else. Yet at the same time, I would love if I could help them by filling out the rest of the data so that they had a complete representation in their tool. And it would help me, because then I would only have to go to one tool to get all the information. So 6 of one, half dozen. It is what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you tell me about why you decided to go for it and obtain the Security Plus and Certified Ethical Hacker certifications?
Security Plus is a requirement of the government. I would not have gone for that. It's a Windows-based security certification. It has very little to do with Linux. They do have a separate one called Security Plus Linux, which probably isn't a whole lot better. I'm not a fan of the company that puts out those audits or those tests. Now, CEH, Certified Ethical Hacker, that's part of a larger program that will get you down a rabbit hole of some deep, dark hacking technology. And that's kind of one of the first steps. So that's why I went for that. It's also in and of itself a fairly lightweight test or program, but it starts to get into some of the ethics, in particular the ethics of hacking and the difference between being, a good guy versus a bad guy versus kind of a neutral person. And it's more focused on, where do you want to take your abilities and what tools do you want to use? Do you want to use tools that just test the environment, or do you want to use tools that break the environment? So
yeah, that's always tricky when you're tuning your vulnerability scanner.
Yeah. Yes. Do you really want to use Nmap to crash the network, or do you just want to use Nmap to scan the network?
So, can you tell me about Girls Who Code?
Girls Who Code. Girls Who Code is a wonderful organization. It's a not-for-profit that works nationwide, actually, maybe globally, but nationwide for sure. They form clubs in high schools and some middle schools, typically in less privileged neighborhoods, to bring in mentors, folks like myself, usually women, but they will take male mentors as well, to lead after school clubs, usually 2 hours, one night a week, to teach the kids kind of anything they want to learn about computing. They have a prescribed curriculum, but you don't have to follow it. I never did follow it the first couple times I did it. I kind of read through the curriculum and tried to follow a little bit, but the school that I was teaching at, the kids were a little more advanced. The curriculum's pretty basic. It's starts you off with block coding with a graphical tool, and these girls were already doing Java and Python, so we just jumped right in. In the last year that I was working with them, we were taking apart the old laptops and putting in new RAM and new hard drives and bringing the old laptops back to life. So
That's really fun.
So yeah, it was fun. It was freaking them out. It's like, no, you push with both thumbs and the RAM comes up, and they were like, I'm breaking it. And I'm like, no, it's okay. So it's a lot of fun to expose the girls to the career field, and you get to, I would basically just tell them all these different anecdotes. I'd tell them what my day was like, and they were just fascinated by what my day was like. So, they listened to me complain about somebody at work, or they listened to the challenge that I had. And so, I'd talk for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'd pick something to do or pick an assignment from the program and do something. My girls continually won prizes for the different projects they did. 1 year, actually 2 years in a row, we live here in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and Volkswagen Audi has a headquarters here, and they have a software challenge every year. And 1 year, their software challenge was focused not at actually writing code, but at coming up with concepts for either code to be written for their new e-tron car, or physical projects to be developed for the e-tron car. And my girls chose the code project, and they black boxed outlined some projects that they think would be good for the e-tron, as far as having a button on the dashboard that would immediately turn the radio off, that wasn't like a dial, but like would mute it for like 10 seconds so that the parent could say something and then it would come back on, to have a way to like mute the TV screens in the back seat so that the parent could talk over the kids. They came up with like 20 or 30 different things, and just kind of just wrote them out, gave them some outlines, said if driver does this, something else does that. If passenger does this, something else does that. They came up with these different steps, and they actually won, and they won $2,000.
Oh, cool.
As a club. And so we went and bought iPads for all of them. So they did reap the rewards for coming up with really good ideas. And the next year, the club got invited again to compete. So
that's really cool.
I found it incredibly rewarding. I did it for 5 years. I felt like a mom. My first group of freshmen graduated my 4th year, and it was all very weavy, and it was fun. And I was very proud of them, and I've kept in touch. I've got girls at Stanford, George Mason, Columbia, Virginia Tech, and these are brilliant kids. They're just really smart, and they've all, for the most part, either gone into mathematics or computers. So
that's really cool.
Yeah, it is.
What advice would you give to girls that might be interested in a career in IT?
Don't be afraid. It's not a boys' field anymore. Don't let anybody tell you that math is for boys, math is for girls, math is for anybody. It's not hard. It really isn't. Math is fun. I love math. I have a math minor. It was just so much fun. Don't let anybody stop you.
Did you face any challenges in the IT field?
Yes, I still do. It's always been tough being, especially early on, in the 90s mostly, I think. It was very hard being a woman in IT because there was a lot of stereotyping about women in math and women in technology, just not being as smart, not being as savvy. One of the reasons that did start to motivate me to look for a reason to leave my government job, I got into a heated battle with the lady who was my boss at the time. We had a Sun server. That's how old it was. It was a Sun server. And we needed to load Sun OS on the Sun server. We had a guy who was scheduled to take the training to load the Sun OS on the Sun server in 2 months. The Sun server was overdue to be delivered to the customer, another government customer. So again, speed of government. And I said, let me do it. I want to learn. Let me do it. And she said, well, you'll break it. And I'm like, well, I can't physically break it. We'll just reinstall it. If I don't install it right, we'll just reinstall it. And she's like, well, you cannot ask anyone for help about anything. I'm like, okay, fine. So I went and took the manual and I started reading the manual, and it was a pretty straightforward install. Install disk 1, install disk 2, install disk 3. So I did all of that, and I got to the last disk, and it was asking for the IP address. Well, I didn't know the IP address. And so I went to my team lead, and I said, could I have the IP address for the server? And he gave it to me, and my boss blew up in my face. She's like, you were not allowed to ask anyone for anything.
Wow.
And she just chewed me up one side and down the other.
Wow.
I'm like, the guy who was going to training wouldn't have known that either. I'm sorry. That's he wouldn't have had that information either. Thankfully, my boss, who's male, defended me, but I mean, she tore me a new one, and I'm just like, I don't want your job. I don't want to be you. I don't know why she was so worried. But I built it right. I put it in the IP, and poof, it was working.
Why wouldn't she want you to ask for help?
The only thing I can think of looking in hindsight, is that she felt threatened because I was another woman in IT. And, certainly back in the 90s, it was quotas. So many women, so many this, so many that. She was Hispanic and a woman. I was a white woman. We were the only women. So, there was some level of, we're a percentage, and there has to be so much of a percentage in the department or else. But I was new. I was only 3 years at the agency. I certainly wasn't anywhere near ranked enough to get promoted to management. I have no idea. I really don't.
Interesting. That's I could definitely see that making me want to leave. It just seems ridiculous.
It was utterly ridiculous, and it really, yeah. I mean, she threw me under a bus for no reason.
Well, I guess maybe looking at something a little bit happier. What is some of the best advice you ever received?
Well, one of the best pieces of advice I received was to become a Girls for Code mentor. While I was working at Akamai at the time, and one of my coworkers walked in and said, "You should do this. You're perfect for this job. You're for this group. You should go do this." And it was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my life. And actually, that same person, his name's Kevin, he said to me, decide now whether you're going to be a generalist or a specialist, and stick with it. Now, it was fairly, I'll say it was about the middle of my career when he gave me this advice. And I've decided, and I'm glad that I did, to be a generalist. I like learning everything, forgetting half of it, relearning it, forgetting another half of it, relearning something new, but always knowing that somewhere in some recess in my brain, I've seen that before. And that because I have, I can learn it again. So that, if somebody says, well, we need you to go touch a Cisco firewall or a Cisco switch or a Cisco this or a Apache web server or a Solaris server or whatever. It's like, yeah, may not have done that in 6 years, but I know where to start. I got a place that I can go to find the beginning, and from there I can go. And I like being, I had a friend yesterday tell me, you're brilliant. You know that, right? I was like, no, I'm not, but thank you. I've got a ton of trivia in my head. A good portion of it's IT trivia. But, it's all jumbled up in there, and it comes out sometimes in the right order and sometimes not. And I think that's that kind of advice, the generalist advice, makes it fun, and it's fun to sort through all that trivia and find what I need when I need it.
Yeah, definitely. What are some of your passion projects?
None of them are IT related.
That's fine.
Ballroom dancing, and just getting back into D&D for the first time in way too many years. I love RPGs, so I'm getting back into an RPG. And it's kind of personal. I'm dating. I'm in love.
Oh, that's great.
So that's a project.
Do you have any parting words of wisdom?
Don't be afraid. Don't let anybody tell you can't. One of the first people I worked with in this field was deaf.
Wow.
So, yeah. And one of my coworkers at AOL was blind. So,
wow.
He was an amazing guitar player and coder.
He's a coder?
Yeah. Fastest touch typer in the West.
How's that work if you're blind?
Oh, it would read back to him through, what was it, Dragon software?
Oh, Dragon Naturally Speaking or whatever?
Yeah. Well, it was whatever it was named. It was Dragon something back then. I think it's Naturally Speaking now. But yeah, he would just type it, and it would just go blah, 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 and he'd go up 3 lines, change a letter, come back down. And yeah, brilliant database coder.
That's really interesting.
Sweetest seeing eye dog on the planet. He would let the dog go. The dog would just wander around the building until, he was bored or whatever.
Do you remember the dog's name?
No, I wish I did.
Interesting. Is there anything else you wanted to share today?
No.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast. Again, I appreciate it.
Thank you. No, this was great.
Hack the planet! Hack the planet!
Welcome to cyberspace.